Lincoln's journey to Washington, a nation on edge, a president-elect, and a divided nation. After Abraham Lincoln's victory in the election of 1860, he faced not celebration, but the unraveling of the nation. By the time he prepared to leave his home in Springfield, Illinois, 7 southern states had already seceded from the Union. Lincoln was not just journeying to assume the presidency, he was traveling into a political minefield. His trip to Washington, D.C. would span nearly 2 weeks, cover over 1,900 miles, and pass through cities filled with both adoring supporters and plotting enemies. Departure from Springfield, February 11th, 1861. On the cold and rainy morning of February 11th, 1861, Lincoln delivered a heartfelt farewell address to a crowd gathered at the Great Western Railroad Depot in Springfield.
To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return. I go to assume a task more difficult than that which devolved upon Washington.
He wept openly as he boarded the train. His neighbors, many of them friends and political allies, stood in silent reverence. The tone was somber, not triumphant. Many feared for his life. The Whistle Stop Tour. Hope and hostility. Lincoln's trip was designed as a public relations tour meant to calm the North, signal resolve to the South, and reassure doubters of his moderation. He passed through Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and more. Indianapolis, Indiana. Lincoln warned that disunion would lead to anarchy. He refused to speak harshly of the South, but emphasized upholding the Constitution. From an address to the legislature at Indianapolis, Indiana, February 12, 1861.
Fellow citizens of the state of Indiana, I am here to thank you much for this magnificent welcome, and still more for the generous support given by your state to that political cause which I think is the true and just cause of the whole country and the whole world. Solomon says, "There is a time to keep silence, and when men wrangle by the mouth with no certainty that they mean the same thing while using the same word, it perhaps were as well if they would keep silence." The words coercion and invasion are much used in these days, and often with some temper and hot blood. Let us make sure, if we can, that we do not misunderstand the meaning of those who use them. Let us get exact definitions of these words, not from dictionaries, but from the men themselves, who certainly deprecate the things they would represent by the use of words. What then is coercion? What is invasion? Would the marching of an army into South Carolina without the consent of her people and with hostile intent towards them be invasion? I certainly think it would. And it would be coercion also if the South Carolinians were forced to submit. But if the United States should merely retake and hold its own forts and other property and collect the duties on foreign importations, or even withhold the mails from places where they were habitually violated, would any or all these things be invasion or coercion? Do our professed lovers of the Union, but who spitefully resolve that they will resist coercion and invasion, understand that such things as these, on the part of the United States, would be coercion or invasion of a state? If so, their idea of means to preserve the object of their affection would seem exceedingly thin and airy. If sick, the little pills of the homeopathist would be much too large for them to swallow. In their view, the union as a family relation would seem to be no regular marriage, but a sort of free love arrangement to be maintained only on passional attraction. By the way, in what consists the special sacredness of a state? I speak not of the position assigned to a state in the Union by the Constitution, for that, by the bond, we all recognize. That position, however, a state cannot carry out of the Union with it. I speak of that assumed primary right of a state to rule all which is less than itself, and ruin all which is larger than itself. If a state and a county in a given case should be equal in extent of territory and equal in number of inhabitants, in what, as a matter of principle, is the state better than the county? Would an exchange of names be an exchange of rights upon principle? On what rightful principle may a state, being not more than 1/50th part of the nation in soil and population, break up the nation, and then coerce a proportionally larger subdivision of itself in the most arbitrary way? What mysterious right to play tyrant is conferred on a district of country with its people by merely calling it a state? Fellow citizens, I am not asserting anything. I am merely asking questions for you to consider. And now allow me to bid you farewell.
Cincinnati, Ohio. He appealed to Kentucky's loyalty as a border state, saying,
We mean to treat you as near neighbors and friends.
Columbus, Ohio, and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Crowds gathered by the thousands. Lincoln appeared at state legislatures, reinforcing his respect for democratic institutions. But the trip also exposed Lincoln to boos, jeers, and thinly veiled threats, especially as tensions escalated in Maryland and Virginia. Baltimore plot, the assassination threat. Perhaps the gravest moment of the journey came in Baltimore, a city teeming with Confederate sympathizers. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, led by Allen Pinkerton, uncovered a plot to assassinate Lincoln as he switched trains in Baltimore. A Southern faction allegedly planned to stab or shoot Lincoln during the transfer at Camden Station. Pinkerton advised immediate action. Lincoln was reluctant to appear cowardly or to avoid the people. But his advisors, including General Winfield Scott and close confidants like Norman Judd, insisted.
I would rather be assassinated on the spot than surrender my principles or abandon the cause of my country.
Still, Lincoln was persuaded to act. Midnight arrival in Washington, February 23, 1861. In the dead of night, disguised in a soft cap and shawl, Lincoln was secretly rerouted through Philadelphia and Baltimore under heavy guard and arrived at 6 a.m. in Washington, D.C., without ceremony. This clandestine arrival was mocked by critics. Newspapers ridiculed him as a coward. The New York Times defended him. The Chicago Tribune wrote that it was beneath the dignity of the man. Northern Democrats and Southerners alike called him the coward president. Lincoln was deeply stung by the attacks but held firm.
I did not believe it was wise to invite murder, however certain I might be to die bravely.
Emotional toll and thoughts. Privately, Lincoln was troubled. The pressure was immense. He had been elected by less than 40% of the vote in a four-way race, and not a single Southern state had supported him. He wrote to friends, expressing both melancholy and resolve. At one point, he is quoted saying,
If I am killed, I can die but once, but to live in constant dread is to die over and over again.
Lincoln leaned heavily on his faith, stating to a clergyman,
I am nothing, but truth is everything. I know I am right because I know that liberty is right.
The nation's reaction. Union loyalists saw him as brave, resolute, and prophetic, especially after word of the Baltimore plot became public. Secessionists saw weakness and mocked his secretive behavior as proof the North was led by a rail splitter in over his head. Border states were split, with many citizens still unsure whether to join the Confederacy or remain in the Union. Historical significance. Lincoln's journey to the capital became a metaphor for the perilous road ahead. He arrived not as a conquering victor, but as a somber steward of a crumbling Union. The threats he faced foreshadowed the immense danger of the Civil War, and his actions, though criticized, likely saved his life, allowing him to deliver the first inaugural address and guide the nation through its darkest hours. Lincoln's journey from Springfield to Washington was not merely a travelogue, it was a crucible. It showed the fragility of democracy, the polarization of a republic, and the loneliness of leadership. Though ridiculed by some and nearly murdered by others, Lincoln stepped onto the national stage determined to keep the Union whole. He began this journey as a president-elect, but arrived in Washington with the weight of the Union on his shoulders, his enemies sharpening knives, and history waiting